The wheat stood golden and defiant under the merciless August sun of 1883, acres of it swaying in the dry California wind, and Julia Anderson knew with absolute certainty that she would lose everything if she could not bring in the harvest alone. Her father had died 3 months prior, collapsed between the furrows he had spent 20 years cultivating, and her mother had followed him to the grave just 6 weeks later, her heart simply giving out from grief. At 22 years old, Julia owned 160 acres outside Weaverville, California, a sturdy farmhouse that needed repairs, and a pride so fierce it burned hotter than the summer heat that baked the Sacramento Valley. She had turned down every offer of help that came her way. The neighbors meant well, she knew that, but their charity came wrapped in pity, and she could not stomach the thought of becoming the poor orphaned Anderson girl who could not manage on her own. She had seen what happened to women who accepted too much help, how quickly generosity turned into ownership, how a helpful hand on the plow became a claim on the land itself. So she rose before dawn each morning, strapped on her father's old work gloves, and attacked the wheat with a scythe that grew heavier with each passing hour. The problem was simple mathematics and cruel biology. One person could not harvest 160 acres before the wheat became too dry and brittle, before the precious kernels began falling to the ground like golden tears, before everything her parents had built turned to dust and loss. Julia knew this, had calculated it a dozen times in the ledger books by lamplight, but knowing changed nothing. She would work until her hands bled and her back screamed and her body collapsed if that was what it took. Pride was all she had left, and she wore it like armor. On the morning of August 15th, Julia woke to the sound of metal against stalk. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, and reached for the rifle she kept propped against her nightstand. The eastern sky was barely beginning to lighten, that deep blue moment before dawn when the world held its breath between darkness and day. She dressed rapidly, not bothering with more than her work dress and boots, and crept to the window. A man was working in her wheat field. She could see him clearly in the growing light, tall and broad-shouldered, moving through the grain with the efficient rhythm of someone who had been born with a scythe in his hands. His horse, a large bay gelding, stood tied to her fence post, and beside it sat a bedroll and saddlebags that suggested he had ridden through the night to get here. Julia grabbed her rifle and stormed outside, her bare feet finding her boots on the porch without her needing to look down. Fury propelled her across the yard and into the field, where the stranger had already cleared a swath of wheat 20 feet long and perfectly cut. "Get off my land," she said, raising the rifle to her shoulder. Her voice came out harder than she intended, sharp as broken glass. The man straightened slowly and turned to face her. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered in the way of men who lived their lives outdoors, but handsome in a rough-hewn way that made something in Julia's stomach tighten uncomfortably. He did not look afraid of the rifle, merely respectful of it. "Morning, Miss Anderson," he said quietly. "Name is Patrick Quincy. I worked with your father 2 summers back, helping him clear the north section. He was good to me when I needed work, and I figured I would return the favor. I did not ask for your help. No, you did not." He shifted the scythe to his other hand, and Julia noticed the calluses on his palms, the careful way he balanced the tool. But the wheat does not care about asking. It is ready now, and it will not wait for pride or permission. The truth of his words stung like a slap. Julia tightened her grip on the rifle, though her arms were already beginning to ache from holding it steady. "I can manage my own harvest." "I am sure you can," Patrick said, and there was no condescension in his tone, no masculine superiority, just a simple statement of fact. But you cannot do it alone, not before the wheat goes to seed. I am here, and I am already working, so you can either shoot me or you can get another scythe and help me. He turned back to the wheat without waiting for her answer, his blade singing through the stalks with a sound like whispered secrets. Julia stood there for a long moment, the rifle growing heavier in her hands, watching him work. There was something almost meditative about his movements, a grace that belied his size. Each swing of the scythe was precise, economical, wasting no energy or motion. Finally, she lowered the rifle. "There is a second scythe in the barn," she said stiffly. "And if you are going to work my land, you will do it right. The bundles need to be tied every 3 feet, and the grain needs to face the same direction for threshing." Patrick glanced over his shoulder at her, and something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, madam. Your father taught me that." Julia turned on her heel and marched back to the house, her cheeks burning with something that was not quite anger and not quite gratitude. She stored the rifle, pulled on her work gloves, and grabbed the second scythe from where it hung in the barn. The wooden handle was worn smooth from years of use, and it fit into her palms like an old friend. By the time she returned to the field, the sun had crested the horizon, painting the wheat in shades of amber and gold. Patrick had continued working, and the cleared section had grown substantially. Julia took up a position 20 feet from him and began her own row, refusing to look at him, focusing entirely on the rhythm of cut and gather, cut and gather. They worked in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the whisper of scythes through grain and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. Julia's shoulders began to ache almost immediately, the muscles protesting the familiar strain, but she gritted her teeth and kept working. She would not be the first to falter, would not give him any reason to think she was weak or incapable. "Your father talked about you all the time," Patrick said suddenly, his voice carrying across the small distance between them. "Said you were smarter than any son he could have hoped for, said you could calculate crop yields in your head faster than most men could do it on paper." Julia nearly fumbled her scythe. "He said that. He was proud of you," Patrick continued, not breaking his rhythm. "Said you had enough stubbornness to move mountains, but that you came by it honestly since he was the same way." Something hot and painful lodged in Julia's throat. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall, and focused on the wheat in front of her. "If he was so proud, he would have taught me to run this place properly instead of protecting me from the hard work." "He did teach you," Patrick said gently. "You are out here, are you not? Working a harvest that would break most men. That is not something you learn from books. That is something bred into your bones." They fell back into silence, but it felt different now, less hostile and more companionable. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and heavy with heat. Julia's dress clung to her back with sweat, and her hands began to blister beneath the gloves, but she kept working. Patrick matched her pace, never pulling ahead but never falling behind, as if they were connected by some invisible thread that kept them synchronized. Around mid-morning, Julia called a halt. "There is water in the well and bread in the kitchen," she said, her voice rough from the dry air. "I will not have you collapsing from heat stroke on my property." Patrick drove his scythe into the ground and straightened, rolling his shoulders. "Appreciate that. You should rest too." "I will rest when the wheat is in," Julia said, but even as she spoke, she swayed slightly on her feet. Patrick was beside her in 3 long strides, his hand catching her elbow to steady her. "Easy," he murmured. "No good comes from working yourself to death. Your parents would not want that." Julia jerked her arm away from his touch, though not before she noticed how gentle his grip had been, how careful. "Do not presume to tell me what my parents would want." You are right, Patrick said immediately, stepping back and raising his hands in a gesture of peace. I apologize. That was not my place. His immediate contrition took the wind from her anger. Julia rubbed her face with the back of her gloved hand and sighed. No, I am sorry. I am not accustomed to help or to company. Come to the house and eat something. The kitchen was blessedly cool compared to the field, and Julia poured water from the well bucket into 2 tin cups while Patrick washed his hands in the basin. She set out the bread she had baked 2 days prior, along with some preserves and cold chicken left from last night's supper. They sat at opposite ends of the rough wooden table, eating in silence. How did you know I was trying to bring in the harvest alone? Julia asked finally, curiosity overcoming her reticence. Patrick took a drink of water before answering. I was in town yesterday, picking up supplies before heading to a job down in Sacramento. Old Mr. Henderson at the general store mentioned that you had been buying provisions every week, but had not hired any hands for harvest. He was worried about you. Everyone in this town is worried about me, Julia said bitterly. They look at me like I am some fragile thing that will break at the first strong wind. That is not how Henderson talked about you, Patrick said. He called you stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, said you had your father's grit and your mother's sharp tongue. Sounded like admiration to me. Despite herself, Julia felt a small smile tug at her lips. Henderson has known me since I was born. He is allowed to call me ornery. And what am I allowed to call you? Patrick asked, and there was something in his tone that made Julia look up sharply. He was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not the predatory look some men got, the one that made her skin crawl and her hand reach for a weapon. This was different, deeper, like he was seeing past her defenses to something she kept carefully hidden. You can call me Julia, she said quietly. Since you are going to be working my land, we might as well dispense with formalities. Julia, Patrick repeated, as if tasting her name. I like that. You can call me Patrick or just Pat if you prefer. Patrick, Julia said, and tried to ignore the way saying his name made something warm unfurl in her chest. If you are planning to stay and help with the harvest, I cannot pay you much. Maybe $20 when it is done and meals while you are working. I do not want your money, Patrick said immediately. I told you I owed your father a debt. My father is dead, Julia said bluntly. Debts die with the debtor, not this one. Patrick's voice was firm, brooking no argument. Your father gave me work when no one else would, paid me fair wages and treated me like I mattered. The least I can do is make sure his daughter does not lose everything he built because she is too proud to accept help. I am not too proud, Julia protested, even though they both knew it was a lie. Patrick just looked at her, one eyebrow raised, and Julia felt heat climb into her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer temperature. Fine, she conceded. I am too proud, but pride is all I have left. If I lose that, what do I have? You have this land, Patrick said, gesturing around them. You have your strength, your intelligence, and your father's legacy. Pride does not keep you warm in winter or put food on the table, Julia. Sometimes accepting help is not weakness. Sometimes it is the bravest thing you can do. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Julia stared at him, this stranger who had appeared at dawn with a scythe and good intentions, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. We should get back to work, she said abruptly, standing and gathering the dishes. The wheat will not wait for philosophical discussions. Patrick smiled, a real smile this time that transformed his serious face into something warm and open. No, I suppose it will not. They worked through the afternoon, stopping only briefly for more water when the heat grew oppressive. Julia found herself sneaking glances at Patrick when she thought he was not looking, watching the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face as he worked. He had removed his hat after lunch, and his dark hair was damp with sweat, curling against his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to brush it back. She caught herself on that thought and nearly cut her own foot with the scythe. What was wrong with her? She barely knew this man, and she was certainly not in the market for romance or companionship or whatever foolishness her traitorous mind was conjuring. She had a farm to save and a future to secure, and there was no room in that plan for storm-gray eyes and gentle hands. But when the sun finally began to sink toward the western hills and Patrick called a halt for the day, she felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. They had cleared nearly 3 acres together, far more than she could have managed alone, and the satisfaction of seeing that much progress was tempered by the knowledge that tomorrow he might be gone. "I should head into town," Patrick said, gathering his tools. "Find a room at the boarding house for the night." "That is foolish," Julia heard herself say. "You will waste an hour riding in and an hour riding back tomorrow morning. The barn has a loft with clean straw, and it is cooler than any boarding house room this time of year." Patrick studied her for a long moment. "Are you sure? I do not want to impose or cause talk in town." "Let them talk," Julia said with more bravado than she felt. "You are a hired hand staying in the barn, nothing more. Anyone who wants to make it into something scandalous has too much time on their hands." "All right then," Patrick agreed. "I appreciate it. And Julia, thank you for letting me help." The genuine gratitude in his voice made her throat tight. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, and turned toward the house. "I will bring supper out to you in an hour," she called over her shoulder. Inside the house, Julia leaned against the closed door and tried to steady her racing heart. This was practical, she told herself. Having him stay in the barn meant they could start earlier and work later. It had nothing to do with the way her skin had tingled when he had caught her elbow, or the way his smile had made her stomach flip, or the fact that, for the first time since her parents died, she did not feel quite so desperately alone. She cooked a proper supper that night, more elaborate than her usual solitary meals. Fried chicken with gravy, biscuits, and green beans from the garden, with a slice of apple pie for dessert. She told herself she was just being a good employer, that anyone would feed their workers well. But she changed her dress before carrying the tray out to the barn, and she had brushed her hair until it shone in the lamplight. Patrick had set up a neat camp in the loft, his bedrolls spread out on fresh straw, and his saddlebags organized with military precision. He was washing up from a bucket when she climbed the ladder, his shirt hanging open to reveal a chest marked with old scars. He turned when he heard her and quickly fastened the buttons, looking almost embarrassed to be caught half-dressed. "That smells incredible," he said, taking the tray from her hands. "You did not have to go to this much trouble." "It is no trouble," Julia said, though they both knew she was lying again. "I will leave you to eat in peace." "Wait," Patrick said quickly. "Would you stay? Eat with me. It has been a long time since I had company for a meal, and I would appreciate the conversation." Julia knew she should decline, should maintain proper boundaries between employer and employee, between man and woman, between her carefully guarded heart and this dangerous stranger. But the loneliness that had been her constant companion for 3 months was suddenly unbearable, and the hope in Patrick's eyes matched the ache in her own chest. "All right," she said, settling onto the straw across from him, "but only for a little while." They ended up talking for 3 hours. Patrick told her about growing up on a ranch in Nevada, the youngest of 5 boys, learning to ride before he could walk and to rope cattle before he could read. His father had died in a mining accident when Patrick was 15, and his mother had sold the ranch and moved back east to live with family. Patrick had drifted after that, working cattle drives and ranch jobs, never staying in one place for long. "I always figured I would buy my own place eventually," he said, staring at the piece of pie in his hands. "Save up enough money, find some good land, maybe start a family. But it is hard to save when you are always moving, always chasing the next job." "Why do you move so much?" Julia asked. "Why not settle somewhere?" Patrick was quiet for a long moment. "I guess I have been waiting to find a place that feels like home," he said finally. "Somewhere that needs me as much as I need it, somewhere worth staying for." The way he looked at her when he said it made Julia's breath catch. She stood abruptly, gathering the empty dishes with trembling hands. "It is late. I should let you rest." "Julia," Patrick said, rising with her. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "No, you said everything right, and that is the problem." She fled down the ladder before he could respond, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Back in the house, she leaned against the kitchen counter and tried to understand what was happening to her. She had known this man for less than a day, and yet he had already burrowed under her skin in a way that felt dangerous and inevitable. She barely slept that night, tossing and turning in sheets that felt too warm, her mind replaying every word they had exchanged, every glance, every accidental touch. When dawn finally came, she rose feeling gritty-eyed and uncertain, but when she looked out the window and saw Patrick already in the field, scythe in hand, working as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, something in her chest settled. They fell into a rhythm over the following days. Rise before dawn, work until the heat became unbearable around midday, rest in the shade of the old oak tree by the well, then work again until sunset. They talked while they worked, Patrick's stories of cattle drives and frontier towns mixing with Julia's memories of growing up on the farm, of her mother's garden and her father's jokes. The silences between them grew comfortable, companionable, filled with the music of scythes and bird song. On the fourth day, they reached the north section of the property, where the wheat grew thickest and tallest. Julia was reaching high to cut a particularly stubborn stalk when her foot slipped in a gopher hole, and she went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. Pain shot up her leg like lightning, and she cried out before she could stop herself. Patrick was there instantly, dropping his scythe and kneeling beside her. "Do not move," he commanded, his hands already probing her ankle with surprising gentleness. "Does this hurt?" "Yes," Julia gasped, tears streaming down her face from pain and frustration. "Everything hurts." "I do not think it is broken," Patrick said after a moment, "but it is definitely sprained. We need to get you back to the house." Before Julia could protest, he scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, wheat and sweat and something uniquely Patrick. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Not on that ankle you cannot," Patrick said firmly. "Stop arguing and let me take care of you for once." He carried her all the way back to the house, never once faltering or showing strain, and settled her gently on the sofa in the parlor. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a basin of cold water and clean rags, kneeling beside the sofa to carefully remove her boot. "This is going to hurt," he warned, and then began wrapping her swollen ankle with the cold compresses. Julia bit her lip to keep from crying out, gripping the arm of the sofa until her knuckles went white. "I am sorry," Patrick murmured, his touch as gentle as he could make it. "I know it hurts. Just breathe through it." "The harvest," Julia said through gritted teeth. "We cannot stop now. We are so close." The harvest can wait a day, Patrick said firmly. Your health is more important. You do not understand, Julia insisted, trying to sit up. If we do not finish this week, the wheat will be ruined. Everything will be lost. Patrick placed a hand on her shoulder, easing her back down. Listen to me, Julia Anderson. I will finish the harvest. You need to rest and let that ankle heal, or you will do permanent damage. Trust me to do this for you. I do not trust anyone, Julia said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not quite true anymore. Patrick smiled sadly. I know, but maybe you could start. He stayed with her through the afternoon, changing the compresses on her ankle every hour, bringing her water and food, reading to her from the Bible, because it was the only book in the house. His voice was deep and soothing, and Julia found herself relaxing despite the pain, lulled by the cadence of his words and the comfort of his presence. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked suddenly, interrupting him mid-psalm. Patrick looked up from the Bible, his gray eyes serious. Because you deserve kindness. Because you have been carrying the weight of this place alone for too long, and everyone needs help sometimes. Because when I look at you, I see someone brave and strong and so determined to prove she does not need anyone that she is breaking herself apart. You do not know me well enough to see all that, Julia whispered. Maybe not, Patrick conceded. But I would like to. Know you better, I mean, if you would let me. The air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with possibility. Julia's heart was racing again, but this time it had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way Patrick was looking at her, like she was something precious and worth protecting. I am not very good at letting people in, she said honestly. I have spent so long building walls to keep everyone out that I am not sure I remember how to open the gate. That is all right, Patrick said gently. I am patient, and I am good with my hands. I can help you repair those walls or tear them down completely, whatever you need. Julia laughed despite herself, the sound surprising them both. That is possibly the worst metaphor I have ever heard. Yeah, Patrick agreed, grinning. It was pretty terrible, but it made you laugh, so I consider it a success. He stayed with her until she fell asleep that evening, exhausted from pain and emotion. When she woke in the night, there was a quilt tucked around her that had not been there before, and through the window she could see a lantern burning in the barn. The next morning, Patrick brought her breakfast in bed, or rather on the sofa, since she had spent the night there. How is the ankle? He asked, setting down a tray with eggs, toast, and coffee. Better, Julia admitted, testing it gingerly. Still sore, but the swelling has gone down. Good. You stay here and rest today. I am going back to the field. Patrick, you cannot do it all alone, Julia protested. It is too much work for one person. Then I will work twice as hard, he said simply. The wheat needs to come in and you need to heal. It is not complicated mathematics. He left before she could argue further, and Julia spent a frustrated day on the sofa, alternating between reading, dozing, and hobbling to the window to watch him work in the distance. She could see him moving through the wheat, steady and tireless, and her heart ached with a confusing mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something she was not quite ready to name. On the 7th day, Julia's ankle was strong enough to walk on, and she insisted on returning to the field despite Patrick's protests. They worked side by side under a sky that threatened rain, hurrying to get the last of the wheat cut and bundled before the weather turned. The air was thick and electric, and Julia's hair kept escaping from its braid to curl around her face in wild tendrils. We are going to make it, Patrick said around midday, surveying the remaining section with satisfaction. Another day, maybe two, and it will all be in. I could not have done this without you, Julia admitted, the words coming easier now. I would have lost everything. No, Patrick said firmly. You would have found a way. You are too stubborn to fail. I just help things along." The first drops of rain began to fall just as they finished the second to last row. They looked at each other and then at the sky and, without a word, began working faster. The rain came down harder, soaking through their clothes, turning the ground slippery and treacherous. Julia's ankle protested with every step, but she gritted her teeth and kept working. They cut the last stalk just as the storm truly broke, thunder rolling across the valley like cannon fire. Patrick grabbed Julia's hand, and they ran for the house, laughing breathlessly, their clothes plastered to their bodies and their hair streaming with water. They burst through the door and collapsed against it, gasping and grinning at each other like children who had just gotten away with something wonderfully forbidden. "We did it," Julia said wonderingly. "The harvest is in." "We did," Patrick agreed, and the way he was looking at her made Julia's laughter die in her throat. They were standing so close, close enough that she could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes, could feel the heat radiating from his body despite their wet clothes. Patrick reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and Julia found herself leaning into the touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "Julia," he said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you build up those walls again." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I came here to help with the harvest because I owed your father a debt. That part was true, but I stayed because of you. Because you are the bravest, most stubborn, most fascinating woman I have ever met. Because when I am with you, I feel like I have finally found that place I have been searching for, that home I have been chasing across half the West." "Patrick," Julia breathed, her heart in her throat. "I am not asking you for anything," he continued quickly. "I know you have been through hell these past months, and the last thing you need is some drifter cowboy complicating your life. But I needed you to know how I feel. I needed you to know that when I look at you, I see everything I have ever wanted and been too afraid to hope for." Julia stared at him, this man who had appeared at dawn with a scythe and somehow managed to cut through all her carefully constructed defenses. She thought about the past week, about the easy rhythm they had found working side by side, about the way he made her laugh and challenged her assumptions, and saw her as capable rather than fragile. She thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion and how it had disappeared the moment he smiled at her. "You are right," she said finally, and watched his face fall. "You are complicating my life terribly. I have spent 3 months convincing myself that I do not need anyone, that I am stronger alone. And then you showed up and ruined everything." "Julia," she cut him off by grabbing the front of his wet shirt and pulling him down to kiss her. His surprise lasted only a second before he was kissing her back, his arms coming around her waist to pull her close. She tasted rain and promise, and something sweet she had not allowed herself to want. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Patrick rested his forehead against hers. "Does this mean you forgive me for ruining everything?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "It means I am tired of being alone," Julia said honestly. "It means I am terrified of trusting someone again, of letting someone matter this much. But it also means I am willing to try if you are patient with me." "I told you," Patrick murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am very patient." They stood there in the doorway, wrapped in each other's arms while the storm raged outside, and Julia felt something in her chest that she had thought died with her parents. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but real. The rain continued for 3 days, trapping them on the farm. Patrick stayed in the house now, propriety be damned, sleeping on the sofa while Julia took her own bed. They spent the hours playing cards, cooking together, and talking about everything and nothing. Patrick told her about his dreams of owning land, of building something permanent. Julia shared her fears about managing the farm, about the debts her father had left, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. "I have been thinking," Patrick said on the third evening as they sat by the fire watching the rain stream down the windows. "About your situation here, I mean." Julia tensed. "What about it?" "You need help running this place," Patrick said carefully. 160 acres is too much for one person, especially during planting and harvest seasons. You need a partner, someone who can share the work." "I told you, I cannot afford to hire." "I am not talking about hiring someone," Patrick interrupted. "I am talking about a real partnership. 50-50 split on everything, equal say in all decisions. I have some money saved, enough to help with the debts and buy new equipment. And I have experience running a farm." Julia stared at him. "Why would you give up your savings for this place?" "Because I am not giving it up for the place," Patrick said, meeting her eyes steadily. "I am investing it in us, in a future I can see so clearly when I am with you. But only if that is what you want too. I will not push you into anything, Julia. If you want me to leave after the wheat is sold, I will go." "And if I want you to stay?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Patrick's face transformed with hope. "Then I will stay for as long as you will have me. Forever, if you will let me." Julia thought about her pride, about the walls she had built, about the fear that had ruled her life for so long. And then she thought about the past week, about how much lighter everything felt with Patrick beside her, about how laughter had returned to this house that had been filled with grief. "I want you to stay," she said, "but as a true partner, not as someone I owe or someone who owes me. Can you accept that?" "I would not have it any other way," Patrick said and pulled her into his arms. When the rain finally cleared, they took the harvested wheat to town to sell. The price was good, better than Julia had dared hope, and with Patrick's savings added to it, they had enough to pay off her father's debts with money left over for seeds and repairs. They stopped by the lawyer's office to draw up partnership papers, making everything legal and official. Then they went to the general store, where Mr. Henderson took one look at them and grinned. "Well now," the old man said, "I see my worrying was for nothing. You found yourself some help after all, Miss Julia." "I found myself a partner," Julia corrected, and felt Patrick's hand squeeze hers. "About time," Henderson said approvingly. "Your father would be pleased. Patrick here is good people." They returned to the farm as the sun was setting, painting the harvested fields in shades of amber and gold. Julia stood in the yard, looking at the land that had been in her family for 20 years, and felt the weight she had been carrying finally lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said to Patrick, who was unloading supplies from the wagon. "For everything. For showing up, for staying, for seeing me as more than just a woman who needed saving." Patrick came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You never needed saving, Julia. You just needed someone willing to work beside you instead of for you. There is a difference." "Is there?" "Absolutely. Working for someone means you do what they say and collect your wages. Working beside someone means you are building something together, something that belongs to both of you." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I love you, Julia Anderson. I think I started falling for you the moment you pointed that rifle at me and told me to get off your land. You are fierce and proud and brilliant, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you can be strong and still let someone love you." Tears streamed down Julia's face, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I am terrified and I am sure I will be difficult and stubborn, but I love you." "I am counting on difficult and stubborn," Patrick said, grinning. "Life would be boring otherwise." He kissed her there in the yard, with the sunset painting the sky and the land spread out around them like a promise. Julia kissed him back and thought about her parents, about the legacy they had left her. Not just the land, but the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking your heart for. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Weaverville. Julia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Patrick wore a new suit that he had bought specially for the occasion. The whole town turned out to celebrate, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Mr. Henderson gave them a beautiful set of crystal glasses, and Mrs. Chen from the neighboring farm brought seeds for Julia's mother's garden, which had gone to weeds over the summer. "Your mama loved her roses," Mrs. Chen said, pressing the packet into Julia's hands. "These are cuttings from my own bushes. They will grow strong here, just like you." Julia cried again, but they were good tears this time, healing tears. Patrick held her hand through it all, steady and solid in hers. They spent their wedding night in the farmhouse, in the bedroom that Julia had slept in alone for 3 months. But she was not alone anymore, and as Patrick held her close and whispered promises against her skin, she finally understood what her father had meant all those years ago when he told her that the right partner could make anything possible. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. They worked the farm together, Patrick's experience and Julia's intelligence combining to make the operation more profitable than it had ever been. They bought an additional 40 acres from a retiring neighbor and expanded their wheat production. Patrick proved to have a talent for horse breeding, and soon they had a small but reputable stable alongside the wheat fields. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Thomas James, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined chin. Julia was terrified throughout the pregnancy, remembering how her own mother had died so soon after her father, but Patrick never left her side. He held her hand through the long labor and wept when the midwife placed their son in his arms. "He is perfect," Patrick said, his voice choked with emotion. "Julia, he is perfect." "Of course he is," Julia said tiredly, reaching for the baby. "He is ours." Thomas was followed 2 years later by Margaret Rose, who had Julia's dark hair and Patrick's easy smile. And 3 years after that came Samuel Patrick, who seemed determined to make up for his late arrival by being the loudest baby in 3 counties. Julia watched Patrick with their children and fell in love with him all over again. He was patient and playful, teaching Thomas to ride almost before the boy could walk, reading endless stories to Margaret, and walking the floors at night with Samuel so Julia could rest. He never complained about the chaos or the noise or the endless work that came with a farm and a growing family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Julia woke before dawn, as she always did, and slipped out of bed without waking Patrick. She walked out to the field where they had first worked together, where he had shown up at dawn with a scythe and changed her life forever. The wheat was growing again, green shoots pushing through the rich soil, and she stood there watching the sun rise over land that felt truly like home now. "Could not sleep?" Patrick asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Julia leaned back against him, smiling. "I was just thinking about the day you showed up here, about how furious I was, how determined to send you away." "You were also waving a rifle at me," Patrick reminded her. "Do not forget that part." "I was terrified," Julia admitted. "Terrified of losing this place, terrified of being alone, terrified of needing anyone. You changed all of that." "We changed it together," Patrick corrected gently. "You were already the strongest person I had ever met, Julia. I just gave you permission to stop carrying the weight alone." "Thank you," she said, turning in his arms to face him, "for showing up, for staying, for loving me even when I made it difficult." "Especially when you made it difficult," Patrick said, kissing her forehead. "That is when you need love the most." They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, painting the fields in gold and green, their children sleeping peacefully in the house behind them. Julia thought about the scared, angry woman she had been 5 years ago, so desperate to prove she did not need help that she had been willing to lose everything. And she thought about the woman she was now, secure in the knowledge that needing someone was not weakness, that love was not a surrender but a partnership. "What are you thinking about?" Patrick asked, studying her face. "That I am glad you are stubborn," Julia said, smiling. "If you had listened when I told you to get off my land, I would have lost so much more than the harvest." "Well, lucky for both of us, I am almost as stubborn as you are," Patrick said, grinning. "Almost." Julia laughed and pulled him down for a kiss, tasting 5 years of morning coffee and shared dreams and promises kept. When they finally broke apart, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Patrick replied, "now and always." They walked back to the house hand in hand as the farm woke around them, ready to face whatever the day brought together. Behind them, the wheat grew green and strong in the California sun, and ahead of them stretched a future neither had dared to hope for on that dawn morning when a proud woman with a rifle met a patient cowboy with a scythe. The years continued to pass, each bringing its own challenges and joys. In 1890, a severe drought tested their resources and their resolve, but they weathered it together, using the lessons Julia's father had taught about water conservation and crop rotation. In 1892, Thomas started school in Weaverville, riding into town on his own pony every morning, much to Julia's constant worry and Patrick's pride. Margaret proved to have her mother's head for numbers, and spent hours helping Julia with the account books, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully added columns of figures. Samuel was happiest in the barn with his father, learning about horses and cattle, coming in for dinner covered in straw and radiantly happy. As their children grew, so did the farm. They built a new barn in 1893, larger and more modern, with proper stalls for the horses and storage for equipment. Patrick designed it himself, and Julia painted it the traditional red that dotted barns across the valley. The children helped where they could, Thomas holding nails and Margaret mixing paint, while Samuel mostly got in the way but tried very hard to be useful. Julia's reputation as a shrewd businesswoman grew throughout the county. Other farmers came to her for advice on yields and pricing, and she always shared her knowledge generously, remembering the desperate loneliness of those months after her parents died when she had felt so isolated and helpless. She and Patrick hosted barn dances every fall after the harvest, opening their home to the community, and the sound of music and laughter that filled those evenings reminded Julia of her childhood, before loss had taught her to build walls. In the spring of 1895, Thomas turned 10 and declared his intention to be a horse breeder like his father. Margaret, 8 years old and fiercely independent, announced she was going to be a teacher and help other girls learn mathematics. Samuel, at 5, changed his mind about his future career approximately 6 times a day, ranging from cowboy to train conductor to President of the United States. "They are good kids," Patrick said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard. "We did all right, I think." "Better than all right," Julia said, reaching for his hand. "They are brave and kind and curious about the world. That is everything I could have hoped for." "They get the brave from you," Patrick said, bringing her hand to his lips. "And the kind from both of us, I hope." "Do you ever regret it?" Julia asked suddenly. "Giving up the freedom of drifting from place to place, you could have gone anywhere, done anything." Patrick turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "Not for one single second." Julia, everything I ever wanted I found right here. A home, a family, work that matters, and a woman I love more every day. How could I possibly regret that? I just worry sometimes, Julia admitted. That maybe you feel trapped or tied down, or Patrick silenced her with a kiss. The only thing I feel is grateful. Every morning I wake up next to you, I feel grateful. Every time I see our children running through these fields, I feel grateful. And every night when I fall asleep in this house we built together, I thank God or fate or whatever force of nature brought me to your door that morning. Even though I pointed a rifle at you, Julia teased, blinking back tears. Especially because you pointed a rifle at me, Patrick said seriously. You were protecting what was yours, fighting for your future. How could I not fall in love with that kind of courage? They sat together as darkness fell, and the children came running up to the porch, breathless and dirty and demanding cookies. Julia watched Patrick scoop Samuel up with one arm while directing Thomas to wash his hands and reminding Margaret to hang up her pinafore, and her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. This, she thought. This was what her parents had wanted for her. Not the farm itself, though that mattered, but this feeling of belonging, of being part of something larger than herself. They had built a legacy together, she and Patrick, one made not just of land and wheat and horses, but of love and laughter and stubborn determination to face every challenge together. In the years that followed, Thomas did indeed become a horse breeder, taking over that part of the operation when he turned 18. He had Patrick's patience and Julia's eye for quality, and under his management, their stable became one of the most respected in Northern California. Margaret went to Teachers College in Sacramento, the first in their family to pursue formal higher education, and returned to teach at the school in Weaverville, where she scandalized the conservative school board by insisting that girls should learn the same mathematics as boys. Samuel proved to be a wanderer like his father had been, spending several years working on various ranches and cattle drives before finally settling down on a small spread of his own just 10 miles from the family farm. He married a woman named Elizabeth who could out-rope most men and made the best apple pie Julia had ever tasted. Patrick and Julia grew older together, silver creeping into their hair and lines marking their faces, maps of laughter and hard work and years lived fully. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Patrick had a fancy photographer come out from Sacramento to take a portrait of the whole family. They gathered in front of the house, 3 generations now, including Thomas's 2 children and Margaret's new baby. And when Julia saw the finished photograph weeks later, she wept at how much her family had grown from that desperate, lonely woman who had tried to bring in the harvest alone. "What is wrong?" Patrick asked, alarmed by her tears. "Nothing is wrong," Julia said, laughing through her tears. "Everything is right. Everything is so right it almost hurts." Patrick wrapped his arms around her and held her close. "I know exactly what you mean." On their 30th anniversary, the town of Weaverville threw them a celebration at the community hall. Neighbors and friends packed the space, bringing food and gifts and stories about how Patrick and Julia had helped them over the years. Alone when times were tough, advice on crops or livestock, a shoulder to cry on when life got hard. Julia had not realized how much they had woven themselves into the fabric of the community until she heard story after story of kindness and generosity. Speech. Someone called out, and others took up the chant until Patrick stood, pulling Julia up beside him. "I am not much good at speeches," Patrick said, his voice carrying across the hall. "But I want to say thank you. Thank you for making us part of this community, for accepting a drifter cowboy who showed up with nothing but a scythe and some foolish hope. And especially thank you for taking care of this woman during the darkest time of her life, even when she was too stubborn to accept help directly." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Julia elbowed him gently. "Most of you know the story," Patrick continued. "How I showed up at dawn one morning to help with the harvest, and Julia nearly shot me for my trouble." More laughter. "What you might not know is that she saved my life that day just as surely as I helped save her farm. I was lost, drifting, looking for something I could not name. And then I found her, this fierce, proud, brilliant woman who needed help but would not ask for it. Working beside her, I finally understood what home meant, what partnership meant, what love meant." He turned to Julia, taking both her hands in his. "30 years later, I am still learning those lessons, still discovering new reasons to love you every single day. Still grateful that you were too proud to ask for help, because it gave me the excuse to give it anyway." Julia was openly crying now, not caring who saw. "I love you," she said, her voice shaking. "Then, now, always." They kissed while the crowd cheered and whistled, and Julia felt the same flutter in her stomach that she had felt the first time he kissed her 30 years ago, standing in her kitchen soaking wet from the rain. The years continued their inevitable march. Patrick's hair went completely silver, and arthritis began to trouble his hands on cold mornings. Julia's eyes needed spectacles for reading, and she moved a bit more slowly after long days in the garden. But they were still together, still working the farm side by side, still finding reasons to laugh and dream and plan for the future. On a warm evening in June of 1913, as they celebrated their 32nd anniversary with a quiet dinner on the porch, Julia looked out at the land spread before them. The wheat was ready for harvest again, green and gold in the fading light, and she could see Thomas and his oldest son working in the far field, continuing the tradition. "You remember what you said to me that first morning?" she asked Patrick, who was dozing in his chair beside her. "When I told you to get off my land," Patrick smiled without opening his eyes. "I said the wheat does not care about asking. It is ready now, and it will not wait for pride or permission." "I was so angry at you for being right," Julia said fondly. "You were angry at me for existing," Patrick corrected, opening one eye to look at her. "The being right part just made it worse." "True," Julia admitted, "but you were patient with me." "I saw who you really were," Patrick said, sitting up and taking her hand. "Beneath the pride and the fear, I saw someone who wanted to be loved but was terrified of being hurt. I recognized it because I was the same way. We saved each other, Julia. That is what love does." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Julia thought about the girl she had been, standing in this very spot pointing a rifle at a stranger who dared to help her without permission. She thought about the woman she had become, surrounded by family and community, secure in a love that had weathered 3 decades of storms and droughts and all the challenges life could throw at them. "No regrets?" Patrick asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Not a single one," Julia said, squeezing his hand. "You?" "Only that I did not find you sooner," Patrick said. "But then again, maybe we found each other at exactly the right time, when we were both ready to stop running and start building." "I was not running," Julia protested. "I was standing my ground." "You were hiding behind your pride," Patrick said gently. "But that is all right. It gave me something to work through, made me feel useful." Julia laughed and leaned over to kiss him, tasting 32 years of morning coffee and shared secrets and promises kept. When she pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing up at dawn, for staying, for loving me through all of it." "Thank you for letting me," Patrick replied, "for opening that gate in your walls and trusting me to come through." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, holding hands and watching the land settle into darkness. Tomorrow, they would wake before dawn, as they always did, and start another day of work on the farm that had brought them together. There would be challenges ahead, Julia knew. There always were. But they would face them together, just as they had faced everything for the past 32 years. And in the quiet darkness, with Patrick's hand warm in hers and the familiar sounds of the farm settling around them, Julia sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought a stubborn cowboy to her door that August morning in 1883. She had been too proud to ask for help, but he had shown up anyway, and in doing so had given her everything she had been too afraid to hope for: a partner, a love, a home, a future, everything.